Well, King David is known for many things, and perhaps one of the things that immediately comes to mind is his defeat of the Philistine giant Goliath. Most children's Bibles or Bible storybooks would contain something about that story. But today, I want to focus in on one particular aspect of his leadership. He was a visionary. Now, I thought I'd better look that up in a dictionary, and this is the definition that we've got. A visionary, someone who perceives and reimagines the future with originality and daring. Someone who perceives and reimagines the future with originality and daring. Now, in this story, David's visionary plans entailed the capture of Jerusalem. And that immediately places this story in its historical context. But first, in terms of this particular sermon series, I have to admit I've got this out of step. How I managed to miss David out when he should have come in the storyline a little bit earlier, I really don't know. But I felt prompted to slot him in today. We began by looking at Joseph, God's forgotten man, and then Moses, God's reluctant leader, then Gideon, God's timid warrior, then we turned to Ruth, God's providential woman, and then we jumped a few hundred years to the prophets, beginning with Isaiah, whom I termed God's downsized prophet. David, however, should have come after Ruth, who was, of course, his grandmother, so should have slotted in between Ruth and Isaiah. David, as I pointed out earlier, rose from insignificant beginnings to prominence, especially in the court of the first king of all Israel, that of King Saul. King Saul, however, became bitterly jealous of David's success. And on more than one occasion, Saul tried to kill David. And David had to flee for his life, and he led the life of a fugitive outlaw. If you like, he was a bit of a Robin Hood of his day. Now, when I say that Saul was the first king of Israel, we need to remember that Israel was something of a federal state, to use a modern political piece of terminology. It was an alliance of 12 tribes, each with their own distinct identity. And as we read the scriptures, we can tell that they even spoke their language in different accents. And it was an alliance of 12 tribes who didn't always see eye to eye. And after the death of King Saul in battle against the Philistines, the 12 tribes parted company. 11 of them crowned Ishbaal, Saul's son, as king. And the tribe of Judah went it alone with one of their own, who was David. And he was crowned king of just the tribe of Judah. So under King Saul's son, there were the 11 tribes to the north. You can see it on the screen in the light green area. And then David down in the south. But this was not an amicable arrangement. They hadn't sat down at a table and worked it out as some sort of treaty. And the scripture tells us in 2 Samuel 3 and verse 1 that the war that ensued between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. And as the years passed, David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. After 7 years of bitter bloodshed, the tribes of Israel said that enough was enough, and they accepted David as their true king. And that's where the reading that we had picks up the story. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. He was 30 years old when he became king, etc., etc. Having thus been crowned king over the reunited tribes, David saw the need for a new capital city. He wanted Jerusalem. But when he looked it up on Rightmove, he found that it wasn't for sale. Hebron had served David well for 7.5 years, when he was king just of Judah, but it was no longer fit for purpose. Why not? Well, in terms of the politics of the situation, it would have been an unwise, perhaps even a disastrous move. Hebron was found well to the south in the territory of Judah. And having become king over all Israel with the other 11 tribes, it would have sent out all the wrong sorts of signals. Hebron would have been open to the charge of favoritism, cronyism, jobs for the boys, in other words, for the people of Judah. And David therefore felt that he needed to distance himself from Hebron. Politically, it didn't work. And in terms of religion, Hebron had no history, it had no revered traditions, it had no standing. And in terms of uniting 12 tribes, having a central point of worship and of pilgrimage would have been important. Hebron simply didn't cut the mustard. Thirdly, Hebron militarily was about as useful as a chocolate fireguard. You see, when the tribes of Judah and of Israel were fighting amongst themselves, the Philistines, the traditional enemies of the tribes of Israel at this time, and many wars against King Saul, the Philistines just looked on and chuckled. This civil war was doing their job for them. They didn't need to march on the armies of Judah and Israel. They were fighting and killing each other. But now that Israel was united again under David, a name the Philistines knew, for he was the scourge of many a battle as the military leader under King Saul. With David now enthroned as the king of all, the Philistines would, of course, sit up and take notice. As a military fortress and headquarters, Hebron was a non-starter. But what was all wrong now with Hebron was all right with Jerusalem. At this point in time, Jerusalem had yet to be conquered by any of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was therefore neutral in a way that Hebron was not. Nobody, no one tribe can claim Jerusalem was theirs. It belonged to no one. And geographically, Jerusalem was right on the border between Judah to the south and the tribes of Israel to the north. And so it would, if you like, be owned by, it would belong to all of the tribes equally. Politically, for the new king of all Israel, taking Jerusalem would be a shrewd move. And of course, Jerusalem had a distinguished religious history. It went back to the days of Abraham and the high priest of Salem with that wonderful name, Melchizedek. You read about him back there in Genesis. He pops up again in Psalm 110, and he's referred to in the book of Hebrews. I once remember having to write an essay on Melchizedek when at college, and I had to scratch my name. What on earth is this guy all about? Oh, I get a round of applause for David at the back. Melchizedek, the priest king of Salem, which became known as Jerusalem. It was already a focus, if you like, a point of pilgrimage, where the one true God had been revered and worshipped. It would serve well as a unifying focus for the faith of all the tribes, an honored and revered place of pilgrimage. And as a military fortress, Jerusalem was ideal. Its elevated position made it easily defensible. Whereas an invading Philistine force would have overrun Hebron with ease, they'd think twice about trying to capture Jerusalem. But there were two problems. This easily defended city was being easily defended by the Jebusites against David. They mocked David when he turned up to take Jerusalem. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought, David cannot get in here. That was problem number one. Problem number two was, I mentioned them again, the Philistines. As I said, they knew all about David's fearsome reputation as a warrior. Now, they weren't going to say amongst themselves, fair play, let David settle in before we attack him. Let him take Jerusalem first. Then we'll have a go at him. Do you think? No way. As soon as they heard that David was king, they would be on the march. He did not have time, did David, for a long, drawn-out siege to take Jerusalem. Within a matter of weeks, the Philistines would have been on his back, and the Jebusites would have laughed even more. And so I love the ease, almost the nonchalance of verse 7. Nevertheless, that's wonderful, isn't it? Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of God. And then the text explains something of how it was done. David perhaps used local knowledge of this water cistern, whatever it was, got inside and then opened the gates from inside. We're not given the details, just this wonderful, almost off-the-cuff comment. Against all the odds, nevertheless, David captured Jerusalem. You see, what we can learn from this story is that what may have suited the needs of the past, as represented by Hebron, may not be God's will for the future. David needed Jerusalem, not Hebron, because he had a vision for the future rather than a sentimental longing for the past. As we gradually emerge into the post-pandemic world, what's our vision of the future? Will we stick to our Hebrons? Do you know what the motto of that is? But Pastor, we've always done it that way. Will we stick to our Hebrons? Or will we be open to the rise of the challenge of a Jerusalem? David's vision to capture Jerusalem was a bold one, or, from a different perspective, a foolish one. The Jebusites certainly thought that he was a fool, and they mocked and ridiculed him as a consequence. In the light of worldly wisdom, David's radical vision was an idiot's pipe dream. And I've discovered that there will always be those who will rubbish visions of faith. Those who will find all sorts of good reasons why nothing should be changed and nothing should be done. Aim at nothing, and then you won't be disappointed should you miss. But how can we be sure that a vision is of God, fueled by faith, rather than perhaps an egotistical pipe dream? We need to have our listening ears in place so that we may know what the Spirit is saying to his church. And David's track record for hearing from God is good. And I'm going to rattle now through some references, just so that we get the force of David with his listening ears open. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? The Lord answered, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, here in Judah, we are afraid. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces? Once again, David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, go, for I am giving you the Philistines into your hand. Same chapter, verse 12. Again, David asked, will the citizens of Keilah surrender to me and my men? And the Lord said, they will. 1 Samuel 30, verse 8. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. 2 Samuel 2:1. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord. Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah? He asked. The Lord said, go up. David asked, where shall I go? To Hebron, the Lord answered. So in the past, Hebron had been God's provision for David. But change in times and change in circumstances mean that we're not rubbish in the past if we do something different. We give thanks to God for our Hebrons, as David would have thanked God for Hebron for those 7.5 years. That doesn't mean to say we can't then look to the future and realize that God is moving us forward. I remember one of my first church meetings in Tonopandi. And the suggestion was that we move from having wooden plates for the offering or the collection and go to having bags into which people could put their money in so nobody could see how much they'd put in. And I can remember one dear old lady saying, but Pastor, we've always had wooden plates. The Lord provided them for us. As if that was the clinching argument. I wish I could have a pound for every time somebody's told me, but we've always done it that way. I'd be quite rich, actually. So Hebron had been provided by God back then, but now there was a need for something different. And then we move into 2 Samuel 5:19. David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack the Philistines? The Lord answered him. 2 Samuel 5:23. David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees. Now, each of those references has got its own story, of course, but I point those verses out to show that David made a habit of inquiring of the Lord, so that what he would say and what he would do would be of the Lord. If we refer back to the story of Joshua in chapter 9 and verse 14, we are told that the men of Israel sampled their provisions. Again, I haven't got time to put in the story there, but they did not inquire of the Lord, and they were led up the garden path as a consequence of it. They thought that it was so obvious what they saw in front of them, they didn't need to inquire of the Lord. There is nothing so obvious as at times we don't need to check things out with the Lord. Having arrived here in World just a few weeks before the first lockdown and all that followed, there have been times, I'll be honest with you, when I've thrown frustrated, perplexed hands in the air praying, Lord, what's all this about? What's going on? Anybody else have shared my frustration at times? Only 2? Well, that's not bad. Like many in positions of leadership, I've been inquiring of the Lord, asking, well, what's the future looking like? What's God got in store? And my sense is that he is not saying, hunker down in your Hebron, Alan, and going back doing what you've always done, but inquire of me for what may be a new and challenging future. Well, I honestly, at my age, did not expect to leave Exeter. I thought I'd be retiring there. But God had something exciting in store for me, and I'm here. David God's visionary king, can we call World Baptist Church God's visionary church?